And what's going on, everyone? Hope you're doing good. Thanks for tuning back into the channel. I wanted to do a video today on the question that every partial preterist postmillennial has to answer. And depending on what you do with some amial camps, some of those guys might have to answer it too. But I specifically have in mind the partial preterist postmillennials with this because this is something that I battled and that I struggled with. In this idea of switching camps eschatologically, I would say that a majority of people today start out in this premillennial camp, and that's understandable because that's what we've been taught growing up. So the natural progression for me was to go from this premillennial camp and then begin to put a few things in the past. Well, when I began to put a few things in the past, I essentially would have called myself an amillennial for a couple of months. I saw this back there on the shelf, and I thought I would get it. So this is Sam Storm's Kingdom Come, and this book is written from an amillennial perspective. It is 500 and let's call it 570 pages. I devoured this book in one day because I loved half of it, and I thought, man, this makes so much sense because he began. That was really the introduction to me to start putting some things in the past. And Sam Storm was amillennial, and he would still do things like divide the Olivet Discourse at certain places and stuff like that. So that helped me kind of start to see some things shifting and say, all right, there's at least something that's going on in the past. And then the more I began to put things in the past, which really, if you think about it, is the paradigm for most people, instead of thinking about it going from pre-mill to amill to post-mill, a better way to think about it's probably, okay, I was full futurist, and then I began to put some things in the past, and I was amill. I put a few more things in the past, and I would call myself post-mill. And one of those main things in this amill to post-mill shift is the end of the age. So the main section, I would say, and the main verse that you would have to posit is Matthew 24:3, which when they asked him, when will these things be and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? If you talk to partial preterist postmillennialists, then a majority of those guys, and I can't speak for everyone because somebody like Ken Gentry thinks that we're still in the age that is and the age to come is our future. But if you take people who think that we're in the age to come, then they think Matthew 24:3 is about 80-70. And the question that all of these guys eventually have to answer is, am I going to be consistent with the end of the age? So if the end of the age in Matthew 24:3 is a reference to 80-70, which I believe it is, then you have to start wrestling with some things. And what you have to wrestle with is the same things that I had to wrestle with. And specifically Matthew chapter 13. Because in Matthew chapter 13, you have the resurrection at the end of the age. So if Matthew 24:3 predicts the end of the age that is, then on what basis does Matthew 13, which speaks of the resurrection tied to the end of the age, on what basis does Matthew 13 become the end of a different age? And the answer is that it cannot. So the question that everyone has to answer is, if I posit Matthew 24:3 in 80-70, how do I not posit Matthew 13 in the parable of the wheat and tares and the parable of the dragnet at the end of the age? How do I not posit that at 80-70? That's your only logical conclusion that you can come up with. And I think Daniel 12 is extremely important to this conversation. I remember asking in a postmillennial group probably a year and a half ago. I asked, because everybody in this postmillennial group in referencing Daniel 12 is saying, oh yeah, everything in Daniel 12 is talking about 80-70 except Daniel 12:2. Daniel 12:2 speaks about the time when those who are in the dust of the earth would awake, some to everlasting righteousness, some to everlasting shame and contempt. So here's the same question. If Matthew 24:3 the end of the age and Matthew 13 is the end of the age, then how are they two different end of the ages? Because you're going to have the resurrection in 80-70. Daniel 12 presents the exact same problem. It is the same issue. I asked this question, and some people would say that Daniel 12:2 would be about in mine and your future, So not at the end of the age. And everything else in Daniel 12 would be 80-70. That is the most inconsistent thing that I have ever heard in my life. Your only logical conclusion and connection is to say that Daniel chapter 12 is speaking of the fulfillment of Ezekiel 37, 36, and it's in connection to Matthew chapter 13 and to Matthew 24, 29 to 31, the gathering that would happen. That's it. That's your only logical connection that you can make. Daniel 12:7 is everybody's problem. Daniel 12:7 says that all of these things, the abomination of desolation, the resurrection, all of this happens at the time when the power of the holy people is completely shattered. Well, unless you want to posit the destruction of the church in our future, which nobody does, then the power of the holy people being completely shattered is a reference to the old covenantal Jewish system that was shattered in 80-70. And at that time, many who were in the dust of the earth would awake, some to everlasting shame, some to everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:13 says that Daniel would rise to his inheritance at the end of the days, at the end of the 70 weeks, which would be the end of the age, Matthew 13, and Matthew 24:3, which, by the way, think about it. They asked Jesus, what to be your sign of your coming at the end of the age? He tells them, you'll see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. That'll be your destruction. Daniel 12:7, the shattering of the holy people. And what would happen at that time? The resurrection would happen. That's why Matthew 13, the resurrection would happen at the end of the age when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered. Matthew 13 and 24 together are nothing more than Daniel 12 married. That's the consistency issue that at some point every partial preterist who says we're in the age to come is going to have to answer. On what basis can you say that Matthew chapter 13 is disconnected from Matthew 24:3? I would love to hear somebody like Jeff Durbin answer that question. I want to know what Jeff Durbin, who says that Matthew 24:3 is the end of the old covenant age, what does he do with Matthew chapter 13? What are you positing happens at the end of the age in Matthew chapter 13? Would he explain this to be as a different end of the age, or would this be 80-70? I would love to know. If anybody knows the answer to that, please leave it in the comments down below. I'd love to hear how you had to work through this. That's a little bit about my journey on it. I tried to find every way out of it. And honestly, people like Ken Gentry for a long time said Daniel 12:2 was something that was in our future, but eventually now he's worked himself back into saying that Daniel 12:2 was a spiritual resurrection that happened in the first century. And that's fine. I believe that spiritual resurrection had begun during the writing of the New Testament during the first century. For those who are living, okay, think about Ephesians chapter 2. You were dead, but he's raised you to life. That's a picture of spiritual resurrection, okay? He's raised them and seated them in heavenly places. Now, they wouldn't have the fullness of that resurrection restored to the presence of God until the end of the age. But those who were dead, those dead saints, they would also at that time, the dead in Christ would rise. They would also come to that inheritance at the end of the age as well. Daniel 12:13, you, Daniel, go your way, you'll sleep with your fathers, you'll rise to your inheritance at the end of the age. Well, Daniel's time of rising would also be the time of 1 Thessalonians 4 when Paul said that the dead would rise. Speaking of those who had gone on. So, just thinking about those questions would help spur the conversation along for a lot of people. I would love to know how you are harmonizing that, no matter where you're at, whether you're on a full preterist side, whether you're on a partial side. Let me know. Give me some thoughts and what you guys think about it. And like, comment, subscribe to the channel down below. Good to see you, and take care. We'll see you soon.